With a voice as smooth as silk, this man, Jing Yuan, has become your new obsession for the next 3 weeks. Or maybe it's still this. We have many reasons to not want to spend on gacha games, and Jing Yuan is not one of them. Luckily for us, he's totally possible to play and enjoy free-to-play, so get ready everyone. Your roster of the hottest Toyo men just expanded to include Jing Yuan, the man with the most luscious locks and highest AoE damage in Honkai Star Rail. This is heavily subject to change when your mom arrives. I've extensively tested Jing Yuan, and today we're going to be going over everything that you need to know about him, including his best builds and stats, as well as teams and light cones. As a heads up, I go live on Twitch when I test things, and also just to play games, so feel free to come by if you want. And with all that being said, my name is Braxophone, and let's talk about Jing Yuan. Jing Yuan's kit describes him in all of his glory. He is a glistening light, a true light bringer, a prana extra. Wait, what the hell does that mean? His entire kit kind of revolves around this tiny little dude called Lightning Lord, but I'm gonna call him Lenny. Lenny is basically just Susanoo. He has his own speed stat, which is 60, but copies Jing Yuan's other stats, including crit. This also applies to buffs that Jing Yuan has when Lenny attacks. By default, he has 3 hits that act as both bounce and blast, where they randomly hit enemies with one multiplier and then adjacent enemies with a smaller one. Now Jing Yuan's kit can add hits to the 3 base, so that when Lenny comes around, he deals even more damage. When Jing Yuan increases Lenny's total hits with his skill or ultimate, Lenny gets 10 more speed for every single hit gained. And when Lenny finally attacks, his stacks reset back to 3. Because these are all separate hits, he can absolutely shred enemy toughness bars. Overall, Lenny is about 2/3 of Jing Yuan's total damage, which will matter when we talk about light cones later. Jing Yuan's skill gives Lenny 2 more hits and increases his speed by 20. It hits every enemy for lightning damage, meaning that Jing Yuan can break every single enemy at once. I've never wanted to be on the other team so bad. You will basically only be using a skill because to max his damage, you need as many stacks on Lenny as possible. His ultimate deals AoE damage to all enemies and gives Lenny 3 attacks, increasing his speed by 30 total. The downside of Jing Yuan's ultimate is that it costs 130 energy to use, which means that you need just over 4 skills to be able to use it, because skills give you 30 energy back. But with that said, this can be fixed by him taking hits or landing knockouts, so it's fixable with team comp and relics later on, and it's not as bad as people make it out to be. Lastly, his technique gives Lenny 3 extra stacks of attacks right at the start of battle, which increases his initial speed and lets you get his hits off sooner. Now, one awesome thing that you can do with this is use Ting Yun's technique to get her ultimate back, and then activate Ting Yun's ultimate before the first turn actually starts, which will allow you to use Jing Yuan's ult before the battle starts by spamming it right after using Ting Yun. And then between those actions and using Jing Yuan's technique, Lightning Lord will be able to attack quickly and at max stacks in the very first cycle of combat. It can be awesome for tearing through that first wave of enemies in Memory of Chaos, and I highly recommend trying it out. Now Jing Yuan's traces are pretty strong too. He has some crit rate ones that'll help him be built easier, but he also has some major traces that impact the value that he brings. For example, Battalion Crush gives Lenny the Lightning Lord bonus crit damage whenever he has over 6 hits to start his attack with. It's a pretty solid damage increase like War Marshal, which gives Jing Yuan and therefore Lenny a 10% crit rate increase for 2 turns when Jing Yuan uses his skill. Both of these traces help with making him able to build crit and dish out tons of damage. Getting 6 stacks on Lightning Lord will happen naturally, and building speed on him with the intention of getting this every rotation doesn't really work as well as it appears, but definitely ult as often as possible to go for at least 6 stacks, because that'll massively increase your damage. And I'll talk about speed versus attack in the build section. He also has Savant Providence, which gives him 15 energy at the start of the fight, which is fantastic for getting his ult up faster, since he does have some energy issues. When you're leveling Jing Yuan, you want to prioritize his talent over anything else, but after you focus on that, leveling up his skill and then ultimate can add a fair bit of damage. Something that a lot of people say about Jing Yuan is that he's only good in AoE, and it's true that at the moment he's the strongest AoE in the game under most conditions, but he also dishes out solid single target damage as well. He's not competing with Seela or Yanqing, but he still deals high damage against one boss. He's just more optimal against multiple enemies. Now, our friend Lenny the Lightning Lord is a super fun and interesting mechanic, but he also made Jing Yuan a pain to do calcs for, since everything depends on the situation. But with that said, my friend LP and I tested out some rotations and made a sheet that proves the strongest build, so let's talk about that next. If you're earlier on in the game and you're not farming 5-star relics yet, giving him anything with attack percent can be pretty dang solid, like the Wild Wheat set. But with that said, his late game build is way too dank. The sets are fairly easy. You want to give him 4-piece Band of Sizzling Thunder to increase his lightning damage and also give him 20% attack after using his skill. Since you'll basically only be using his skill, this works out pretty well. Another option you have is to use 2-piece Wild Wheat and 2 Band for attack bonus and lightning damage, which isn't going to be as good as the 4-piece set, but it's not really much worse either, and it might allow you to be more flexible with your pieces. Now for planar sets, you want to run Salsado to give him some more crit rate and also increase ultimate and follow-up damage. The important part here is that many characters' ultimates aren't a majority of their damage, so this effect usually isn't that crazy, it's just good. But because a majority of Jing Yuan's damage is from Lenny the Lightning Lord, this effect gets a ton more value on him than a lot of other characters. This is his best planar set hands down. You can also opt for something like Space Healing Station if you give him speed, and that's fine as well, but Salsado is going to be the best option. His stats are a little bit more complicated though. After testing out and calculating damage potential, his best stats are going to be crit rate or damage on the body, speed or attack percent on the boots, lightning damage sphere, and attack percent on the rope.
But Brax, that's like way too many options, I can't choose.
Well, let me explain. Imagine this. You're making smoothies at home for you and your roommate, and you have the option of putting strawberries or oranges into the smoothie. You can only put one of the two in the smoothie though, and you can't open their bedroom door to ask them which they want because you don't want to risk your life inhaling air that's been breathed by a league player. You have to choose one, but if you choose wrong, an unknown volcano 15 feet from your door will erupt and completely cover you and your floor in lava. Which do you choose? This is the debate between speed and attack percent, except, well, wait, exaggerated. Unless you've looked at their history of what kind of smoothies they've drank in the past, you have no way to be able to tell which one you want to go with, unless they explicitly tell you, which the game is obviously not going to do that for your stats. The answer is that it just depends, and it's not a one-size-fits-all. And like how you just have to know your roommate and what they like, you'll just have to know your team and what they bring. Typically, the shorter a fight is, the stronger attack is, since it's all front-loaded damage, and waves resetting will reset characters' turn order. But the longer a fight is, the better speed is, since it's more total attacks and also more ult charge over time. Without things to bring your action forward, speed is actually going to be better on Jing Yuan because it allows Jing Yuan to attack more frequently, which gives Lenny more attacks and also moves him up further to delete enemies. Now keep in mind the longer a fight goes, the better speed becomes, and so to be safer, I recommend going with something like speed boots. But it's possible in late game at very high investment and with things like Dance 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 and Bronya's action forward, you would want to use attack percent to deal a lot more damage. And lastly, if you can't decide, just use whatever has better substats, because honestly both are good. Now speaking of substats, if you're running attack on your boots, you only need 2 speed minimum. But if you're running speed boots, you can get 10 speed from your substats, which will put you at 134 speed, which would be more than ideal for getting extra attacks over less cycles. And then after that, just prioritize crit, attack, and break effect. The last thing I wanted to quickly mention is that some folks are saying to run energy regen rope, and while that is an option that you do have, I don't personally recommend it. Energy regen rope allows you to get your ultimate more frequently, and it can make it so that you only need 3 attacks to get his ult instead of 4. But there's a few issues with it. The first is that it requires you to take more hits or beat more enemies than attack percent would in order to actually get your ult sooner than you could normally. With attack percent, after 4 attacks, you're only 5 to 10 energy short without other sources, as opposed to energy regen, which will be 17 to 20 energy short without other sources. This basically just means there's more RNG on if you'll actually get it. But on top of that, compared to attack percent, at least in testing and calculations, it looks to be a bit worse as seen on this chart. Now with all of that said, it's still not that bad of an option, but the main reason I don't recommend it is actually just because it's so hard to get an energy regen rope since they have such a low drop rate. And it's even harder to get one with good substats. Between that and the RNG of needing extra energy to be able to ult in 3 instead of 4, the RNG of actually getting the rope, and the attack percent just being stronger, I recommend attack percent. Whew. Alright, to reiterate, 4-piece Band or Wild Wheat, or a mix of the two, crit rate or damage body to try to get your crit ratio to be 50 to 100 minimum, and then you'll want attack percent or speed boots, lightning damage sphere, and attack percent rope. I also do just want to mention a quick note about Break Effect Rope. I don't personally recommend building it on him for all content, but it technically can be solid damage when you're playing a ton of attack buffs already and or against enemies that are all weak to lightning. Lenny breaks a lot of toughness, and because of that, he can actually be pretty solid with Break Effect, though I don't personally recommend it for all around content. Now, Jing Yuan's signature light cone is really strong, and tons of people have been asking if there's any good free-to-play options for him, so let's talk about those next. So just as a heads up, at the end of this section, I'll have a chart comparing the damage of the Erudition light cones on Jing Yuan. But first, I'm going to talk about most of them. Jing Yuan's light cone is very strong on both him and other Erudition characters, as the only light cone from the Erudition to offer crit, damage bonus, and high base stats. It's a great pickup if you have the Jades to spend, but there is no need to sweat it if you don't. On Jing Yuan, it's his top choice, but there are other options as well, and will be more throughout the game's lifespan. The next best option for Jing Yuan is going to be the Battle Pass light cone, another peaceful day at S5, since it adds a ridiculous amount of damage bonus with absolutely zero downside and has a pretty high base attack. Himiko's light cone is a decent stat stick for Jing Yuan since it gives attack based on the amount of enemies on the field and a damage bonus based on break, which Jing Yuan does a lot. For the best free-to-play option though, you'll be looking at Seriousness of Breakfast, since you can S5 it over time and get some damage bonus and attack as well, and it also has a higher base attack than the 3-star cones, which makes them not worth as investing in for him despite the 3-star cones having good effects. Genius's Repose is very strong, but also situational. With Jing Yuan, you'll be able to clear out tons of enemies and get the crit damage buff, but in content with few enemies, this one falls off pretty hard. The Birth of the Self increases follow-up attack damage, and with Jing Yuan's main damage source being Lenny, the damage bonus ends up being pretty significant. Here's the Erudition light cones that are the top options for Jing Yuan ranked. As you can see, his light cone is a fair bit ahead, with the Battle Pass cone right behind, and a lot of other options all in pretty close proximity. Hopefully this chart is a pretty good reference for which one to choose if you're confused. Oh, and if you don't have any 4-star light cones yet, you can throw on Sagacity for a bunch of attack, but just be aware that eventually you'll get the Seriousness of Breakfast for free. After you've geared Jing Yuan, you want to put him in a team that works well with him, so next up, we'll go over his role in a team setting, and then we'll talk about who plays best with him. All right, let's build some Jing Yuan teams. I'm gonna show you what you need to know about putting him into literally, any team he can be in, so let's do it. First off, Jing Yuan is not a super squishy character. He's not gonna be the kind of character to go down in one hit like some of the supports that you're going to be using. Because of both that and the fact that he has some energy problems, he actually has a position on teams if you're going to be playing a tank. If you're playing a tank alongside him, like Fire MC, for example, you might think to put Fire MC over here, maybe on the side, just out of the way, so that way Jing Yuan doesn't get hurt. But because we want him to generate some energy, and you generate energy whenever you get hit, you actually want to put Jing Yuan right next to Fire MC. By doing this, it's going to solve his energy problems whenever Fire MC takes hits because of her taunt, and it's going to help Jing Yuan get his ult up faster. This is one of the biggest team tips I have for him because a lot of people are going to try and build energy regen on the rope, and it's really not that necessary. You can just put him on the side of your tank or the side of the character that has the most taunt. And same thing if you're playing someone like Clara. If you're playing Clara, you can put him right next to Clara, and when she gets hit, if she gets hit with a cleave, he's also taking some damage. So it makes him more likely to get hit without directly getting targeted. But where Jing Yuan really shines is with a bunch of buffs and debuffs against the enemy. Similar to our other character Zilla, who we've made a guide on a long time ago, who benefits a lot from buffs as well. Now with that said, just because someone benefits from buffs does not mean they can always take full advantage of all of them. One buff that he can take full advantage of is going to be Ting Yun's buff. Ting Yun is able to give him a 3-turn blessing, which is going to basically allow his Lightning Lord to also inherit those stats whenever it's time for it to attack. So Lenny can take full advantage of Ting Yun's buffs, and also on top of that, her ult also lasts 2 turns, which is another window for him to use Lightning Lord as well. Ting Yun is basically married to Jing Yuan, and you're going to want to use Ting Yun in basically every single Jing Yuan team that is possible. This character is so incredibly good for him. She can solve his energy problems, and she might as well be married to him. You're not married to him, Jing Yuan is. I'm sorry. I didn't make this choice. This is just how they were made in the game. But aside from that, you have other slots that you want to fill as well. So you might be thinking about Bronya. And one of the issues that you'll have by trying to run Bronya alongside Jing Yuan is that Bronya's buff with her skill only lasts for 1 turn. This basically means that as soon as you move Jing Yuan up in the priority, he gets the buff for that turn that he attacks, but as soon as he's done attacking, that buff disappears, which means that Lightning Lord actually doesn't inherit her skill buff. You might be thinking that this makes Bronya a bad pick, but actually, funny enough, Bronya is still very good with him. And the reason is probably different than you might think. Lenny gets attacks whenever Jing Yuan uses his skill or ultimate. By using his skill, you get 2 extra hits. By using his ultimate, you get 3 extra hits. Now, the benefit of Bronya is that if you actually make Jing Yuan faster than Bronya, what happens is Jing Yuan will attack first, and then you can use Bronya to bring Jing Yuan back up, which will allow him to get 2 extra hits on his Lightning Lord. While he may not be able to inherit the buff that Bronya gives on her skill, he is still going to be able to get more hits than he normally would, and that's going to effectively increase his damage by a fair bit. But on top of that, her crit buff also lasts for more than 1 turn. If you go over here and you look at her ultimate, attack and crit damage up for 2 turns, which means that Lenny can get all the good stats from Bronya. She may not be able to buff Lightning Lord directly, but she is able to allow Jing Yuan to get more hits on Lightning Lord, and for that reason, I still believe Bronya to be a solid pick, and also because she helps him get his ult faster by moving him up in the priority. Now, for the last spot, you're gonna need some kind of sustain or support. So if you have Japard is a top pick for this, but I do not have Japard or Bailu on this account, so I'm gonna go with Natasha. And when these characters are fully kitted out, they shouldn't be getting 1 shot if they're low level, or if your relics aren't maxed out, or if your light cones aren't maxed out. These guys may not actually get to live for that long, maybe not long enough in Memory of Chaos, but when you do have them all fully kitted out, they're not going to be getting 1 shot anymore, and that's going to be fine. Also, by running 2 harmonies, you can run lots of light cones that buff your team, and that can be really beneficial as well. But if you don't have Bronya, or if you're not really a fan of this playstyle, or if Bronya's married to Sela, which, I mean, she very clearly is. But if you don't have Bronya, or if you're looking for a free-to-play option, or you just don't want to use her in this team, that's totally fine, because Pela is actually a very strong unit with Jing Yuan. The thing is, as I mentioned before, with Jing Yuan's buffs, if they expire at the end of his turn before the Lightning Lord can go off, this means that he's not actually getting the buff on the Lightning Lord, which means the Lightning Lord, Lenny, is not going to be hitting as hard. But with someone like Pela, you're actually waiting for the enemy turn to move, as opposed to Jing Yuan. So by debuffing the enemy, by lowering their defense, you're actually allowing Jing Yuan to get full advantage of the buff by waiting for the enemies to go, rather than waiting for Jing Yuan to go. This means even if Jing Yuan is the fastest person on the entire team and going 30 times per turn, you don't have to worry about the defense shred wearing off. And on top of that, because Pela has AoE defense shred, Lenny can take full advantage of that and smash down against all of those enemies that have their defense lowered. And also, Pela's a pretty skill point positive character. Ting Yun's pretty skill point positive. The thing is with this team, actually, you're probably going to have to force use Pela's skill a few times, which is totally fine. But if you did go with someone like Japard instead of Natasha, you could also use his skill a whole bunch, and that would also be fine. So this is just another example of a team that you can run. Lastly, I like to run this team, which I mentioned before. You go ahead and put Jing Yuan next to your tank, so that way you can generate some more energy. And the benefit of this team is actually even more so if you have Japard. Fire MC is not really going to be enough to keep these guys alive, at least not at the level we're at. Maybe at full investment, you could make something work. But as of right now, Fire MC is not going to be able to solo tank this. But with that said, if you have someone like Japard, so pretend Fire MC is Japard, you can run Jing Yuan, Pela, and Welt. And the benefit of running Pela here is that Pela is, again, debuffing enemies as opposed to buffing your characters. Ting Yun can only have a buff up on 1 character at a time. You could also run Bronya here, and that would be fine, but Bronya also uses her skill points fairly often. And between these characters, if you're using Japard with basic attack, Pela with basic attack, Jing Yuan and Welt can both use their skill. On top of that, Welt also acts as a form of mitigation by himself by delaying the enemy's actions and allowing you to take more turns before the enemy acts, which lets you get your ult up faster before they can. And on top of that, Welt's damage contribution is actually pretty significant. This character does a lot of damage on top of delaying enemies. So with these characters together, you can actually get a lot done. Now that said, Japard, like I said, is going to make this significantly easier. And the reason Pela is here is just so you can get full value out of their debuff. Whereas if you're running Ting Yun or Bronya, you wouldn't be able to get as much value. But one last thing that I did want to mention is the use of Asta, because a lot of people were curious if Asta would work with Lenny and if Asta would be good with Jing Yuan because she would allow him to attack faster to give Lenny more stacks. Unfortunately, the answer is no, she does not speed up Lenny. However, she does speed up Jing Yuan, and by speeding up Jing Yuan, you can get more stacks on Lenny, and Lenny's going to be able to attack faster and deal more damage. On top of that, her attack share is going to share with Lenny as well. So Asta is unironically a very good pick for Jing Yuan teams, though it is worth noting that Asta at the moment does not look to be better than running Ting Yun or Bronya, but as an amazing free-to-play support, she can be very, very valuable. On top of that, most of you guys are running multiple teams in Memory of Chaos, right? So you need one team with your Scylla, and that could be maybe the Ting Yun team if you wanted to, and then you could have Jing Yuan on the Asta Pela team, and that would just be one way to to get some use out of some supports while having two very powerful carry characters on either side of the Memory of Chaos. So building teams with Jing Yuan isn't incredibly difficult. He can get a lot of value out of a lot of different characters, or out of playing with a lot of different characters. And I would imagine, just as, you know, a heads up or like a bonus tip, I would imagine that Silverwolf, when she comes out with her ability to debuff enemies and plan to debuff on them, I'm gonna say Gambler Girl is Silverwolf. Let's say this is Silverwolf. You're gonna be able to play a character like Bailu, Pretend Serval is Bailu, and then you would also be able to play with Ting Yun as well in a team like this, where you could use your skill on Silverwolf, and you have Bailu, you have Ting Yun, and you have Jing Yuan, and your skill point economy is not gonna be that bad. You're gonna be able to absolutely decimate opponents, because he's gonna be able to shred enemy toughness like no other character in the game for Lightning right now. And combined with 3 other electric units and Silverwolf, odds are you're going to be getting an electro debuff on the enemy. And even if it's quantum, you're still getting some break. So that's probably going to be a good team, and I'll make an updated video on it when she comes out. So yeah, let's move on to Eidolons, because I want to talk to you guys that are spending probably more money than you should. Now, if you've made it to this part of the video, I commend you for being able to listen to me this long, but also, don't do it. I know he's beautiful, but he's just pixels, he's not real, and he can't take care of you, and I know that you can take him but not in a fight, but it's not worth eating instant noodles only for the next 4 months. Jing Yuan's Eidolons are decent, but some are bait, so I'm gonna go over what they do, and then try to convince you not to pull for copies of Hoyo's Most Beautiful Man. His E1 makes it so that when Lenny does an attack, the multiplier on adjacent targets is increased, which can help with clearing enemies in AoE. Basically, the damage dealt to enemies adjacent to Lenny's target take half of the multiplier of the main target instead of the usual 25%. This, in my opinion, is the stopping point if you're gonna get Eidolons on Jing Yuan. His E2 makes it so that after Lenny takes an action, Jing Yuan gets a 20% damage increase on his basic, skill, or ultimate for 2 turns. This isn't an increase to Lenny's damage, but it does make Jing Yuan a bit stronger. The problem with it is that Lenny is 66% or more of Jing Yuan's damage, so you're basically buffing the smallest damage split of Jing Yuan's kit, which makes it not as major of a buff as it seems. E3 levels up his ultimate and basic attack, which are the 2 least important traces for his damage. E4 is kind of insane for Jing Yuan's uptime. It gives him 2 energy back for every hit that Lenny does, which can let you ult in 3 turns instead of 4 in some instances, or ult in 2 turns sometimes with Ting Yun. This can lead to more stacks for Lenny to attack with, which is essentially more damage and less energy issues. It's pretty dang good. E5 is where a big increase to his overall damage is coming from, since it levels his talent and skill, which is a majority of his damage. E6 is his strongest though, which kind of makes sense because you're spending like $1,000. It makes it so that enemies get a debuff called Vulnerable when the Lightning Lord attacks, and it stacks for every hit up to a maximum of 3. Every stack makes enemies take 12% more damage. It's a pretty big increase to Lenny's damage and therefore Jing Yuan's. Overall, many of his Eidolons are actually written in a way that makes them look better than they are. While they all help Jing Yuan's damage by a fair bit, I don't particularly recommend investing in them unless you're going all the way to E6, where you'll see a pretty big jump in damage output. If you're a Dolphin and Jing Yuan is your favorite character, I'd recommend stopping at E1, but before that, I'd actually recommend grabbing his Light Cone if you're gonna spend, since that Light Cone will bring you a lot more value for your account overall. Jing Yuan is an absolute monster in Honkai Star Rail, and he's going to carry you through so much content that you'll definitely be glad that you rolled for the hottest man. Now, the big problem with Jing Yuan is that Hoyo's hottest woman is coming soon, and so are we. And she does happen to be Lightning, which means that if you're going for Jing Yuan, you may end up pulling for 2 AoE Lightning units, and that's fine. Ultimately, this character just adds to your account, and he makes your progression a lot more streamlined with his insanely high AoE Lightning damage. Having 2 of them isn't going to hurt, it's just going to mean that one of them is benched sometimes. Overall though, I'm very happy with Jing Yuan's power level, and I hope that you guys are as well. If you learned anything watching this video, make sure to subscribe and like the video so that YouTube knows it doesn't suck, and leave a comment down below with a fun cat fact. I don't know, I'm running out of ideas here.